I was very happy when my book, Just and Unjust Wars, against all my expectations, was adopted as a text at West Point. Adopted as a text by officers, many of whom disagreed quite strongly with what I had written, but thought that the arguments were useful for the cadets to engage with. That's what I hope to be doing.
So welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Michael Walzer. He is a political theorist and public intellectual, Professor Emeritus at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and Editor Emeritus for the magazine Dissent. His work has spanned a wide range of political topics regarding war, terrorism, intervention, and many other issues of foreign policy and more. His books include, among many others, Just and Unjust Wars, Spheres of Justice, On Toleration, Arguing About War, The Paradox of Liberation, and many others, as I said. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome, and thanks so much for being here, Professor Walzer.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so great. There were a few things I wanted to talk about. What I want to start with, though, is on just war and as well as relation to terrorism. So, I guess just for those who are not so familiar, how would you kind of briefly describe what just war theory is and some of the principles of just war theory?
Well, I think that people have been judging wars and judging the conduct of wars ever since there were wars. But just war theory is the work of Catholic theologians, starting with Augustine, but the major work done by Aquinas and then by the Dominicans in Spain in the 16th century. I think the best way to describe it is to say that it has two parts. There are the judgments that we make about the decision to go to war. This is called jus ad bellum, the justice of the war itself. And then the judgments we make about the conduct of war, jus in bello, judgments which are, on my view, and this is a disputed view, independent of the judgments about the war itself. That is to say, a just war can be fought unjustly, and an unjust war can be fought, this is more rare, but can be fought justly. There are people now who would add a jus post bellum, questions about the peace that follows the war and the character of the peace and the judgments we make about the situation after the war has ended. So there are many arguments about just war theory. It has become a staple, I think, for young philosophers, most of whom disagree with my view. But I think it is a guide to the way we ought to think about going to war and about how we wage war. Um, I wrote about it because when I was in 1967, when I was running around the country giving speeches against the war in Vietnam, I found myself using categories that I didn't make up. Categories like aggression or intervention or humanitarian intervention or civilian immunity. And so I began to read, starting with the Catholics. And that was the origin of Just and Unjust Wars, which came 10 years later.
Yeah, very good. Something you said there that I guess it shouldn't be so surprising is that this sort of discussion has been going on for many centuries. What wars are just, in what cases is it warranted to go to war, and so on. And I think one of the principles of just war that you appealed to when talking about terrorism was the non-combatant immunity, right? People not that aren't combatants, they're not soldiers, they're not fighting in the war. They should have immunity. They shouldn't be attacked indiscriminately or anything like that. So, yeah, could you maybe talk a little bit about that and the relation to terrorism there?
Well, the specific relation to terrorism is that terrorism is the deliberate killing of innocent people for a political or a military purpose. Maybe I should say also to express a political ideology or a racial or ethnic hatred. Terrorism can be expressive, but it is mostly purposive. Since it is the deliberate killing of innocent people, it is, in my view, always morally wrong. And that is, the issues come up most often when the terrorists are non-state actors, like the Irish Republican Army or the FLN in Algeria. But it is important to stress that states can also be the agents of terrorism, as the bombing by the Brits of German cities in deliberate bombing of German cities when they aimed at working class neighborhoods to dehouse, as they said, the German working class. That was terrorism, it seems to me, and I think that Hiroshima was an act of terrorism.
Right. Yeah. I do want to talk about this kind of related stuff about World War II and Nuremberg trials that you wrote on as well. But one of the big issues that comes up in discussions about terrorism is, well, how do you combat it? And specifically, how do you combat it sort of justly, or avoiding some of the, sins you want to protest against? So, like minimizing collateral. I mean, dealing with terrorists can be a difficult issue, both outside of war and on the ground. I mean, how do you think? What are some of the maybe issues there and concerns to figure out?
Well, I think you're probably referring to the asymmetric warfare, which is warfare between a high-tech army like the American army and a low-tech insurgency like the Taliban. And the central moral problem of asymmetric warfare is that the low-tech insurgents generally hide among the civilian population. They fight from civilian cover. And then the army, the high-tech army, ends up killing civilians. There is then a question, who is responsible for those civilian deaths? Is it the insurgents who put the civilians at risk? And often do it deliberately, because the more civilians the high-tech army kills, the more likely it is that they will lose the war. That's a rough quote from an American colonel in Afghanistan who actually said around 2010 or 11, the more civilians we kill, the more certain it is that we will lose the war, because it was a war in part for the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. And so then the question is, what risks should the high-tech army take? What risks should it ask its soldiers to take in order to reduce the risks that they impose on civilians? And that is a much controversial issue in the American army, and also in the Israeli army. Those are the two armies that have fought the most asymmetric wars in recent years. What risks should they, the Americans, the Israelis, impose on their soldiers, require their soldiers to take, in order to reduce the risks to civilians? And there are General McChrystal issued a new set of regulations for fighting, a new code in around 2010 or 11, which was aimed at reducing civilian deaths. And many American soldiers were quoted by journalists as complaining that this greatly increased the dangers that they had to face on the battlefield. I can give you some examples of how that works. You called me a political theorist, but I work close to the ground. I'm not a high-flying theorist. So here is an example that was suggested to me, but given to me by an American colonel who had been in Afghanistan. So a group of American soldiers approach a village, a town, and there is a small apartment building, and Taliban fighters are on the roof. They're firing at the Americans. What do? You don't know. The Americans don't know if there is a family in the building, or a number of families, maybe held there against their will, or maybe they're there simply because they had no place to go. In the old days, this colonel said to me, in the old days, we would just pull back and call in the artillery, or an airstrike. But under the new rules of engagement, we can't do that. So the lieutenant on the ground, the real commander on the ground, has to decide. He can ask some of his men to get into the apartment building to see if there are people inside, or he can try to get people on a roof nearby where they can fire directly at the Taliban on this roof. And both of those involve asking his soldiers to take risks that they obviously wouldn't have to take if the artillery dealt with the Taliban on the roof and everyone in the building. So that's the situation, and the local commander can decide, this colonel told me, he can decide that if the risks are too great, you can just pull back. You'll get the bad guys on the roof another time. It's a long war. And that was a new American doctrine, because the old doctrine was you never leave the battlefield to the enemy. And it's the junior officer who has to make those kinds of decisions, and they are really very hard decisions. These are the men he is commanding are men for whom he has responsibility, professional, moral responsibility. He can ask them to do what is necessary for the military mission, but can he ask them to do more than that in order to save the lives of civilians who are, after all, enemy civilians, and perhaps even being used by the enemy? So that's the central moral issue. I've written about it, and there have been many disagreements about this issue. There are people who say we don't have to ask our soldiers to take risks to save civilians who have been put at risk by the enemy. The responsibility is solely on them. And I have argued that we are morally required to take some risks. A theorist can't say, even a low-flying theorist can't say 13 or 26. Some risk is the argument that I have made, and that's a judgment in each case. And junior officers have to be trained to make those kinds of judgments.
Yeah, good stuff. I mean, it makes sense to me that it would be right to take at least some risk, because, I don't know, these are innocents. I mean, even if they're part of a nation that you're at some war with, they're non-combatants. They're innocents in some sense, and some risk for their lives seems appropriate. But these rules of engagement that you alluded to are a bit more, involve more hesitancy to take action when the risks are too large. Just more likely to retreat or just disengage. That's right.
Right. Right. Let me give another example from World War II. You said you wanted to talk about World War II. Imagine here's a factory making tanks for the German war effort. It's located in a working class neighborhood, not deliberately, but that's where they built factories when workers didn't have cars. The Brits or the Americans decide the factory has to be taken out. And then there are choices. You can fly by night, which means you will lose fewer planes to anti-aircraft fire, but you are likely to hit all around the factory, and if you hit the factory, but certainly all around it. You can fly at very high altitudes with the same consequences. You can fly by day, and at low altitudes, you're much more likely to hit the factory and not the surrounding houses, but you're also likely to lose more planes. And so how do you decide what you're going to tell your pilots to do? And actually, in World War II, the American Air Force, in contrast with the Brits, flew more often at day and at lower altitudes. And of course, that was especially important to do if the factory was in occupied territory. Because I'm not sure there is a moral difference between German children in World War II and, say, French children, but we did take greater risks when bombing a factory in France than in Germany.
Right. Yeah, I want to talk more about that, but you mentioned sort of in passing that you, well, you're not just a political theorist. I mean, you have some, you have your ears to the ground, so to speak. You have some understanding of war and actual events. And I was just wondering, how significant or how important is understanding historical context and also just, I don't know, interacting with and maybe even having some experience with war and other events like that to theorizing about those things. Maybe that wasn't the best phrase question, but
I was not a soldier. I was too young for Korea and too old for Vietnam. Or I was actually an exempt college student in Korea during the Korean War. And I was very conscious of the importance of knowing as much as you can about the experience of war. So I spent 5 years reading military history and reading the novels and poetry of that soldiers had written, and talking to veterans of World War II and of Korea. I think that's crucial to writing about these subjects. I've written some very critical pieces about philosophers for whom the subject of just war theory is not war. The subject is just war theory. And they write about the work of other philosophers. And some of it is very, very smart. The way philosophers can be very smart, but somehow disengaged from what I think of as the moral realities of warfare.
Yeah, fair enough. I was going to ask, maybe this is a big topic, but a lot of this has moral relevance when you're talking about justness and moral action and what's morally warranted or right. I mean, do you think much about broader issues of morality and metaethics and that sort of thing, or is it mostly just leaving that aside and kind of think about it more in the specific cases? You see what I'm getting at?
I don't think much. I don't write at all about meta-ethical questions. I guess I do think about them, but I don't write about them. I have compared the kind of work I do contrasting it with someone who is interested in the foundations of ethics. I like to say I live in the house, and I don't look at the foundations. I live in the house, and I try to figure out room by room what the furnishings are and how we live there. My work is it's sometimes been called conventionalist. I start with, and I think just war theory starts with, the actual judgments that people make about warfare and tries to develop them in a systematic way and apply them in an objective or as objective as possible way. But whether the foundations are in divine revelation or human creativity, I lean toward the second view, but I haven't tried to describe what it means for vulnerable human beings to figure out their own vulnerability and how they are to live together. I think something like that is what happens, is how morality develops. And I think you could possibly write a history of morality, starting with something like the recognition of that Thomas Hobbes describes, that any human being can kill any other human being by strength or stealth. That we are all vulnerable, and for Hobbes, that is the starting point of all moral arguments. I'm willing to think about that, but it's not where my interests lie.
Yeah, would you say that maybe some of these more fundamental issues are not really relevant to the stuff you write on? Because it's like, okay, we have these norms that we accept, perhaps of engagement and interaction, and we can various rights and so on, and we can apply those and think about these particular cases in war, and whether those are ultimately conventions or something divine or something else is not really relevant to the discussion you're having. That's one way to think about it.
That's what I think.
Right.
And it may be the reason why most philosophers probably wouldn't consider me a philosopher.
Well, it's blurry lines, I'd say. Where does philosophy end, and I don't know, normative ethics or political theorizing begin? So I guess I did want to touch on the stuff about Nuremberg. So yeah, it's been over 75 years now, I guess, since the end of the Second World War and the Nuremberg trials that followed it. And you've suggested, though, that there's still some important political and legal lessons to be learned from these events. And one thing you pointed out is that maybe it would be better to have something that can really act as an international legal body, like impartially passing judgment and carry out punishments where necessary. That's something that was sorely missing in Nuremberg. Is this broadly right, or maybe you could talk a bit more about this issue?
Well, I think actually Nuremberg was a success because the four powers, the U.S., the Soviet Union, the Brits, and the French, did constitute a complete, very temporary, ad hoc, but a complete political system. There was the legislative authority, the London Conference, where the four countries agreed on a protocol for the trials. And then there was an executive in the sense that the four parties agreed on collecting and bringing the defendants to Nuremberg, and then enforcing the punishments that the trial produced, the decisions that the trial produced. So there you have in miniature, you have a judicial branch, a legislative branch, and an executive branch, and that has not existed since. And I don't think that I'm not an advocate of a global state which would have those institutions in a permanent way, and which would override all existing national jurisdictions. I do think it's important to try to reconstitute that ad hoc moment, that Nuremberg moment. And it was done briefly after the wars of the former Yugoslavia. There were genuine trials of a similar sort in The Hague. Similar, I mean, to Nuremberg. And I would very much like to see something like that for the war, the Russian attack on Ukraine. I have to say that the spectacle of our Attorney General Garland in Ukraine offering to help the Ukrainians bring the Russian atrocities to the International Criminal Court was not anything to be proud of, since we have refused to join the International Criminal Court precisely because we didn't want our soldiers to have to live with the possibility of being charged by this court, and now we are eager for Russian soldiers to be charged. I think the arrangements have to be ad hoc, and they have to bring together something like a legislative moment, an executive moment, and a judicial moment. And as I say, it's not easy to do that, and the justice done in those moments will always be imperfect, as Nuremberg was, as people have pointed out. It was not able to prosecute Germans for crimes committed in Germany, since it was administering international law, or trying to do that. Anyway, I am not. I'm not enthusiastic about a permanent court like the International Criminal Court, which exists without executive or legislative authority. And then you get situations like when the court indicted the then ruler of the Sudan, and he proceeded to expel all of the NGOs that were doing humanitarian work in the Sudan, and the court had no ability to enforce its indictment or to protect the people it had put at risk. So I do look for moments like Nuremberg where there is the possibility of a more genuine, where the political circumstances are right for judicial decision making.
Right. So you would say that you kind of prefer that sort of temporary, in the moment, ad hoc system, like what happened in Nuremberg, to something more stable or international.
Well, I tend to think that Immanuel Kant was right when he suggested that a world state would be a soulless despotism. Mm-hmm. But if there could be alliances among the existing states, creating the necessary three authorities for genuine justice, no, I could support something like that. But I am a believer in the state system, imperfect as it is. partly because the nation state is the only, has provided the only political space where a left politics is possible. And it's very hard to imagine the kinds of social movements that have won victories for justice in many different nation states. It's hard to imagine how you would bring together citizens of the world in activities of that kind.
Yeah, some good points. And what about you mentioned that, okay, maybe there's some sort of international, if there's some sort of alliances that lead to something that kind of acts like international government, that's something in principle you might be able to get behind. But what about something that's just acts as like the judicial wing, based on some sort of, international alliances? I mean, could that be good in your view, or?
It might be. I don't know exactly what you're describing.
Well, yeah. I guess maybe I'm thinking of something like the ICC, although I'm not sure the details of that. But something like that could act like that, as an international body charging and carrying out punishments for crimes and so on. Maybe with a bit more power, and I'm not sure how to put it exactly, but.
Well, I mean, the International Criminal Court is apparently going to try to play a role like that, but without the executive power. If it indicts Russian soldiers for specific crimes, Putin might just respond by staging crime, indicting the Ukrainians he has captured. And charging them with similar crimes, and there would be no enforceable power that could defend the Ukrainians or enforce, that could protect any retaliation, could avoid any retaliation by the Russians. It's hard to imagine how the current arrangements can be made to work.
Yeah, fair enough. A couple other things related to this. I think you've written on how you don't think that soldiers or combatants themselves should be held responsible for the wars that they're fighting. I mean, they might be responsible for the individual crimes they commit, but if the war that they're fighting is unjust, perhaps, or criminal, those are not crimes for which they should stand. Is that, I don't know, is that correct?
That's my view, and it does depend on making a clear distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, those two judgments of the war itself and the conduct of the war. And that is one of the major sources of disagreement, partly on the basis of the thinking through the domestic analogy. I have argued that let's look at a war, say the Russian invasion of Finland in 1939. It was an unjust, an act of aggression. I believe the commanders, the political and military commanders of the Russian army were responsible for the aggression, but individual soldiers were not. They have to be judged, as you said, for what they do in the course of the war. And that has translated into the maxim that the Finns and the Russians on the ground in battle have an equal right to fire their guns, because the soldiers are not responsible for the war. They are responsible for their own conduct, and in the battle they are defending themselves and their fellows, and they have an equal right to fight. Now think of this same situation in a domestic society. An armed robber breaks into a bank, and is confronted by an armed guard in the bank, and we would say the bank robber has no right to shoot the guard. The guard has every right, if threatened by the robber, to shoot the robber. There is no equality in a situation like that. And I have argued again and again that the circumstances of warfare are very, very different from the circumstances of domestic society. And I think most philosophers now writing about just war theory would not agree with me. Although it's very, very hard for them to draw any conclusions from their view that, say, in the Russo-Finnish War, the Russian soldiers were as guilty as the bank robber, since there's never been any inclination to punish, after a war, to punish individual soldiers simply for the act of fighting for their country.
Yeah, I wonder how much of the, opposition or hesitance to do that sort of thing is just a sort of pragmatic concern. I mean, are we going to put thousands or hundreds of thousands of soldiers on trial? Like, whereas if there were just a few of them doing those same things, I mean, maybe we would, because it's a practical difference there. I mean, could that make a difference?
Now, I think the what I call the moral reality of war is that these are 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. They've been told that their war is just by their political leaders and possibly by their parents and preachers and teachers. They've been sent into battle along with comrades. And it just doesn't make sense to me to impose on them, to tell them that they have to decide for themselves, whether this war is just. And I'm perfectly willing to honor those who say this is an unjust war and refuse to fight it. That's commendable, but I would not. I would not think it is right to blame them, let alone punish them, if they simply do what everyone then in their world is telling them is the right thing to do.
So part of the issue there is that, they just perhaps didn't have enough information, or they were, being pushed by others or the community or their leaders and so on, to engage in this. And it wasn't really something that they should have been able to figure out was an unjust war, or perhaps, I don't know. These things kind of reduce the blame on them for going to war in this case. Right. Yeah.
And I think some contemporary just war theorists would say that that's right, but it's an excuse. It's not that they're innocent, but that they are excused by these circumstances. And it seems to me, in this case, it comes to the same thing.
Right. Yeah. How do you think of the difference there, though, between an excuse and innocence, or like if there's a legitimate moral reason to not do it? I mean, how it could be an excuse in some sense, but aren't they then innocent in a way? I
Yeah,
mean,
there's a huge philosophical literature on excuses.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I have not studied that literature or joined in it. In this case, it doesn't seem to me to make an effective difference. They're going to go home to their families after the war, and whether they are innocent or excused, uh, I, I don't think it's going to affect the way they are received or the way they are treated if they travel afterwards, and even if they travel into the country with which they were at war.
Yeah. Just returning briefly to the stuff about Nuremberg, I guess one of the concerns that people probably have about conducting things in that way, sort of in the moment, ad hoc, for the specific event, it's a bit riskier, perhaps. That at some occasions it might not be operated as well or as effectively. Whereas if you have something stable with existing regulations, and you can be at least more confident that it's going to run in a consistent way. I mean, that might be one concern for engaging as it was in Nuremberg. Or what do you think about that?
Well, it's obvious that Nuremberg was partial justice. There was no possibility of prosecuting crimes committed by any of the Allied forces. So yes, it is. If you can imagine a global state with an impartial judiciary and an effective executive and good laws, yes, you would then have, in theory at least, a system much more likely to do justice. But I don't think there's any foreseeable prospect of a state of that sort. So the question is, given the global society of states, what's the best we can do? Actually, I think after the wars of the former Yugoslavia, the court that met in The Hague did pretty well, perhaps even better than Nuremberg, since there were jurists from many more countries involved in the trials, and I think there was no avoidance of crimes committed by any of the engaged parties in the conflict.
Right. So, I mean, how else could this be improved given the way things are? Like, is having more jurors from other countries preferable? Maybe that makes it a little bit more impartial.
Yeah,
what else do you think? Yeah.
Well, in a sense, it was, in the case of the former Yugoslavia, it was pretty much the rest of the world judging the combatants in this very local war, and it may be that contrast in scale that made justice possible. I doubt that you can imagine a situation like that with regard to Russian or Chinese or American war crimes.
Just because there's just not that scale difference that you can have there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So any judgment there is not going to be, it's going to be a bit more partial, perhaps, necessarily, because.
Or it may be with regard to Russian conduct in Ukraine. It's going to be a question of the opinion of mankind and not of any actual judicial decision making.
Yeah, I mean, have you thought much about how that might be handled? Or you mentioned that the ICC might play some role there. Would you support that, or how do you think?
Well, I think there probably will be indictments of particular Russian, maybe leading Russian politicians, and maybe just soldiers. I think there will be indictments, but they will only be enforceable against soldiers already in the hands of the Ukrainians, and there will be no protection for Ukrainians in the hands of the Russians. So I suspect that there won't be actual trials.
Yeah, and that's, you've already touched on this, but that's a sort of limitation of these sorts of trials, or however you want to put it, which is that there's not going to be people who are Russians in Russia aren't going to be prosecutable or by any sort of international body like this.
Right. Right.
I mean, is that something we just should live with that in this case and generally, or is that, or should that be? Should we try to do something about that, or like general?
Well, we're not unlikely to have a chance to live without it, to live in any other way. But I do think that the conscience of mankind, the global public opinion, is important. And it may have significant effects on politics in Russia at some future time. So I think it's important to document the crimes and to write about them, to talk about them. I don't think in this case there can be the right kind of judicial proceeding.
Yeah, fair enough. I did want to turn to a couple other things. I've written a fair amount on like intervention, and I read one of your articles on promoting democracy in other countries, and what should the aims of that be, and so on. And yeah, maybe if you want to just talk about that briefly, like what the goal of promoting democracy should be in the world, or how do you think about that, maybe?
Right. I am a defender of humanitarian intervention, with a lot of qualifications and specifications of when and how. I do believe that if confronted with something like the killing fields of Cambodia, when in the days of the rule of the Khmer Rouge, that it was right of the Vietnamese to intervene. I assume in all those kinds of cases, motives are mixed. They probably had some strategic as well as moral reasons, but they did stop the killing. And I think it is important that someone do that. I supported the NATO or intervention in Kosovo. I would have supported an intervention in the Sudan. I think it's a case of whoever can should, and it's obviously best if the intervention is not a great power, but one of the neighboring countries, like the Vietnamese in Cambodia, or the Indians in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. Since there's likely to be some cultural affinities and understandings if neighbors go in. I've written a lot about the follow-up, how important it is to go in to stop a massacre, and how important it is to get out as soon as you can reestablish some form of local decision-making. I don't think that when you intervene in say Kosovo, that you need to refrain. I don't think you have to refrain from trying to influence the government that replaces the murderous government. But I am inclined to think that democracy promotion has to be the work of the citizens of the country where the possibility of democracy has arisen. And I would not favor any kind of military intervention solely for the sake of regime change and democratic promotion of democracy. I don't think you can promote democracy by sending an army across a border. But there's another issue that comes up in the article on promoting democracy, and that I later wrote a book about, and that is the question of distinguishing the foreign policy of, say, the United States from the foreign policy of the left in the United States. I think it's very important to think about. Of course, we, as citizens of the United States, we will think about the foreign policy of the United States. But as leftists, I would argue we need to think about the foreign policy of the organizations of the left, even the magazines of the left. What are our commitments? What do we try to promote? I believe in some version of internationalism. If there are democratic forces struggling in some country in the world, we might, I think, rightly oppose any American armed intervention, but we might very well support sending leftists, sending volunteers, agitators, providing moral support, financial support for the forces of democracy in this imaginary country. There are many things that left organizations, trade unions can do to help in democratic struggles in other countries. So I think it's wrong to focus only on what states can do.
Yeah, a lot of good points there. I mean, would you say that? I don't know. I feel like I got the sense that you were somewhat non-interventionist, except where it's like morally necessary to do so. I mean, would you say you have that leaning, or is just or not? Is more intervention okay as long as it's done justly? I mean, what do you think?
I'm generally a non-interventionist. I often invoke the famous articles of John Stuart Mill, who defended a non-interventionist foreign policy in Britain in the 19th, imperial Britain already in the 19th century, arguing that the important political decisions have to be made by the inhabitants of the country. Democracy won't be sustained if it doesn't have a strong base among the citizens who have fought for it. And yes, so I am a non-interventionist, except when it comes to stopping a massacre. On the other hand, I have to recognize after World War II, the United States did set up a democratic government in Japan. We wrote the Constitution. So if you fight that kind of a war, a total war, and win, then perhaps you have the duty of political restoration, reconstruction, and if you are engaged in political reconstruction, you might as well choose the best regime as your object of reconstruction, and that would be a democratic regime. There is even a clause in the Japanese Constitution defending gender equality at a time when we were nowhere near defending gender equality here at home. But a woman on MacArthur's staff wrote this sentence, and it got stuck into the Constitution of the Japanese. A couple of years ago, there was an effort by conservative forces in Japan to repeal this sentence, and the woman who wrote it went over there to defend her handiwork. I think she did well in those circumstances.
Yeah. Yes, that's something I know very much about, but yeah, no, good stuff. Let's see, I did want to cover a couple other things. You'd written a book called let me get the title here correctly. Yeah, Foreign Policy for the Left.
Yes.
A couple years ago. I guess it was 2018, 2019. How would you talk about that? Why is it important, do you think, to have a foreign policy for the left rather than just, for America or for a different country? Or how would you think, what's the significance there?
Well, the left is not just a collection of individuals. It has organizations, NGOs of different sorts, labor unions, political parties, even, as I said a minute ago, magazines, and all these entities need to figure out what we ought to do, whatever our government does, internationally. We ought to have our own foreign policy. I mean, the obvious example is the old communist and socialist internationals. the left in 1936 did urge France, Britain, the United States, to send arms to the Republic. But the left also organized the international brigades that went and fought in Spain. So that was the foreign policy of the left, was not the same as the foreign policy of, and it didn't mean that the left didn't fight to change the foreign policy of France and so on, but it had its own foreign policy. Now, there's a lot to say about the role of the communists in Spain, as George Orwell has said some of it very well. You could criticize the foreign policy of the left in instances like that one, but I think it is important for the organized left to think about what it ought to do. As I said a minute ago, in promoting leftist values in other countries. And we do that as again with propaganda, with moral engagement and political engagement, with money, contributions. There was another example of this, I guess. The revolutions in the very incomplete revolutions in Serbia and then Georgia and then Ukraine. Some of the same agitators turn up in all three places. And I think that's a good thing. And that's those are internationalists. So that's all I mean. But I think it's very important not to just think of what states can do, but also what we can do, what our organizations can do.
Right. What people and groups and organizations, not necessarily governmental organizations on the left, could do, and where they should focus their efforts and ideology, I guess, in terms of foreign policy. That makes sense. Yeah. I guess somewhat relatedly, you have, I think, an upcoming book maybe coming out next year called The Struggle for a Decent Politics on Liberal as an Adjective.
Yeah.
Is that correct? I mean, do you want to talk about that, what that's going to be about? And
it's really about the adjective liberal. I wanted to call the book The Adjective Liberal, but the people at Yale thought that wasn't a title that would attract attention. It starts from two books that I admire. In 1937, the Italian anti-fascist intellectual Carlo Roselli, actually the leader of the largest non-communist resistance to fascism in Italy, wrote a book called Liberal Socialism. Published in 1937, it was translated into English and edited by Nadia Urbanati, who was working that year at the Institute in Princeton. Liberal Socialism. And then I have a friend in Israel, Yael Tamir, who wrote a doctoral dissertation, later a book with Isaiah Berlin at Oxford called Liberal Nationalism. So I began to think, what's the adjective doing in phrases like that? And then I ended up writing a book about arguing that liberal is best understood as an adjective qualifying much more substantive commitments And it's a book about my own commitments. So there is a chapter on liberal Democrats, liberal socialists, liberal nationalists, liberal communitarians, liberal feminists, written at the insistence of my sister, and checked by every woman in the family, liberal professors, and liberal Jews. So, and I'm trying to argue what does the adjective do, and I think it does important work in all of those cases. So that's what the book is about. It's a much more personal book than anything that I have written. It may be my last book.
Well, that's maybe not. But I was going to say, you don't really want to use liberal then as a noun, right? Or it's like it's really, or you're just saying that this is the adjectival use here is what you're focusing on. Yeah.
I don't think that liberalism these days is a strong substantive ideology. In Europe, it mostly still means libertarianism. And in the US, I guess it mostly means something like New Deal liberalism. It's our very modest version of social democracy. But it really doesn't have a strong, consistent value. And I think most of our commitments, as with me, are to things like democracy or socialist equality or national self-determination or communitarian mutuality, or I think those are our actual commitments, and I think in all those cases the modifier liberal does useful political work.
Right. So when you would say that, like, take liberal democracy or liberal Democrat, I mean, would you say that what liberal is doing there is it's just really modifying the more substantive commitments of being
democracy, right, means the rule of the majority, the consent of the governed, or a majority of the governed. And liberal democracy says that the majority should rule, but within the constraints of human rights, civil liberties. So the ruler of Hungary, Orban, calls what he's doing in Hungary illiberal democracy because he doesn't believe that there should be constraints of that sort on the rule of the majority, which he embodies, the will of the people. So that's a very useful, easy example of liberal as a modifier. And an important modifier. It works against populist authoritarianism.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like you could talk about how what exactly or at least approximately the commitments that come along with that modifier, perhaps in that case and in other cases. I mean, does that vary a lot? Would you say that, like, when you add that modifier to democracy versus, one of the other examples, like, so whatever, liberal feminist, is this doing a similar thing in those cases, or is it kind of?
I think it is constraining and pluralizing. In the Democratic case, it means more than one political party, and it also means that in the socialist case. I think with some, I think in the feminist case, one of the key issues is state intervention against gender discrimination in ethnic and religious groups? Should the state intervene to insist that that the priesthood has to be open to women, or the Orthodox rabbinate be open to women? And our state, partly because it's a liberal state, doesn't insist on that. On the other hand, I think if you start working through all of the possible interventions and thinking about liberal values, intervention to insist that parochial schools and Jewish day schools educate the boys and the girls equally, I would defend the intervention of that sort. And I've worked through a whole series of cases of that kind, thinking always about what the adjective liberal does. Liberal nationalism is, first of all, the recognition of the legitimacy of other nations. It's a pluralizing. It gets to the heart. It gets back to the origins of Giuseppe Mazzini's decision to found Little Italy, and then Little Germany, Little Switzerland, and Little Poland. Not little. What was his word? Young Italy, young Germany, young Poland, and young Switzerland. He created, he wanted what he called a concert of nationalities. So liberal is definitely a pluralizing adjective.
Yeah, that seems really interesting. I'll look forward to that book when it comes to probably be available on Amazon or.
It's Yale won't bring it out until January, I think.
Fair enough. This has been really great. I do want to wrap up in a little bit. I did want to ask a question. I normally end with a question about the value of philosophy and or the specific area and fields in which people work. I did want to maybe put that a little bit differently. How do you think political leaders and people with authority in that area might learn from, and how would you like them to learn from, like, political philosophy and the sort of stuff that you work on?
Well, I think, first of all, that a democracy depends on argument and the engagement of many citizens in the political arguments. Not necessarily everybody. I don't think everybody has to be interested in politics. I once wrote an article called "Two Cheers for Participatory Democracy." I think there is a right not to participate, but it is important if a lot of people are participating in these arguments, and then there has to be room for those of us who try to reflect on the arguments and organize them and perhaps express them in some coherent, or maybe not entirely systematic, but coherent way. I think it's helpful to do that, and I would like to think that that political leaders or the advisors to political leaders read these arguments in their most coherent form and think about them and learn from them. I write for my contemporaries, and I try to write in a. This was very important when I was editing a left magazine, which you mentioned, called Dissent. We had a very strong commitment to Orwell's principles about politics and the English language. We were writing for our fellow citizens, and we had to write in an accessible way. I try to write political theory, as I said, close to the ground, which means avoiding weird hypotheticals, using historical examples, using contemporary examples, talking directly to what I think are the concerns of the people that I'm writing about. So I was very happy when my book, Just and Unjust Wars, against all my expectations, was adopted as a text at West Point. Adopted as a text by officers, many of whom disagreed quite strongly with what I had written, but thought that the arguments were useful for the cadets to engage with. That's what I hope to be doing.
Yeah, and I think you've certainly done that. It's been I think your work has been enormously appreciated, and I definitely appreciate you coming on here to talk with me today. This has been really great. Politics isn't really my expertise, but I enjoy talking with people like you as it is. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on and taking my questions and providing some awesome answers. It's been great.
Okay, thank you.